Please take your seats. My name is Graham Wood. I'm a visiting fellow at the Stockdale Center, and I'm delighted to bring you this panel with two distinguished speakers talking about technology and its relation to liberalism, challenges to liberalism, giving their impressions on whether those challenges are alarming, concerning, fatal. We'll find out. With us here, nearest to me, is Cass Sunstein, a professor at Harvard Law School. And next to him, Jovana Davidovic at the Stockdale Center, as well as at the University of Iowa. And Jovana, please, up to you.
Okay, so first of all, thank you so much for having me back. I love the McCain conference. It's sort of a highlight of the military ethics circuit. And it's just lovely to be back. I always forget how beautiful this place is and how wonderful the conversations here are. So I'm really happy to be back. So I'm going to be trying to talk a little bit about the effects of AI and their effects specifically on liberal democracy. I'm going to try to, as both Joe and a few other people mentioned, not just talk about the problems, but also try to talk about solutions. And we'll see if they're promising in any way, shape, or form. So where do I point? Okay, thank you. So there are two sort of key ways in which I think algorithmic driven threats present themselves to liberal democracy. First, they threaten what I'm going to call epistemic agency, our ability to form and control the way we form and revise our beliefs. But also, they threaten political agency in as much as they threaten our epistemic agency. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Secondly, liberalism is meant to allow for, support a pluralism of values. It's also meant to allow and support some level of pluralism of what I'm calling facts, right? We should be able to disagree both about values and to some extent about facts, but there is an upper threshold to that. There has to be some sort of core set of, maybe not values, but there's got to be a core set of facts that we agree on so we can sort of keep moving forward as a society. And so I think there are some familiar epistemic threats to our ability to form knowledge and beliefs that have always been around, but have sort of been turned up by the presence of AI in particular. So I'm going to talk about a number of them. I'm going to talk about filter bubbles and digital echo chambers. I'm going to talk about nudge algorithms and micro-targeting, and I'm going to talk about generative AI, and then I'm going to try to say a few things about how we might deal with these, what I'm calling AI-driven threats to liberal democracy. So epistemic bubbles and echo chambers have been around forever. We didn't need AI for them. These are sort of the situations in which we find ourselves isolated from opposing voices, where we only hear what people that share our views have to say, and so on. What has come recently onto the scene, of course, over the last 10 or 15 years, have become filter bubbles, which are algorithm-driven social media epistemic bubbles, and digital echo chambers. So again, algorithm-driven social media variations on a familiar phenomenon. And we all know that these things have played a really significant role in this post-truth phenomenon. They're not different than non-AI-driven epistemic bubbles. They're just more prevalent and have potential to become more dangerous, to exclude alternative voices from us being exposed to alternative voices. Nudge algorithms and micro-targeting are another two forms of AI-driven threats to liberal democracy. Nudging has always been around again. It's just a way we present choices to people that seem potentially like open choices, but we present them in the way that nudges you in one direction or another. A lot of marketing does that. Again, this is a threat to the way we form, freely or not, beliefs, has also always been around. It's just that in today's world, We're getting better and better through the use of big data and AI models. We're getting better and better at successful nudging. So getting people to behave in ways we would like them to behave by presenting them with supposedly free choice, but actually one that sort of gets them to do what we want them to do. Micro-targeting is probably best exemplified by the Cambridge Analytica scandal, right? So lots and lots of data scraped from Facebook in this particular case that was used to micro-target individuals with specific political messages. Just this morning in the New York Times, there was an article that Modi, during the Indian election, did this very thing. In fact, they built hundreds of thousands of videos through generative AI to micro-target each individual voter. And for each individual voter, they were addressed in their own language, and they were told something like, you know, you got this benefit from the government, and you got this benefit from the government, you got this benefit from the government, so you should vote for Modi's government, right? And so this type of micro-targeting, obviously that is directed at an individual in their own language, that finds them somewhere in the sort of digital space, presents a particular form of influence that was not before seen. Finally, we have generative AI. This is what nowadays I feel like everybody and their mother, I think, nowadays thinks that AI is just generative AI. And it's basically using deep learning models to either create new text or create audio or create video that's, well, fake. Right? And so this is exactly what Modi's government did. There's been an increased use in politics. There's been an increased use in regulation, right? So Michigan has just passed a law prohibiting deep fakes and political ads. I'm sure we've all come across or seen the robocalls in New Hampshire that sounded like President Biden saying, you shouldn't go out to vote tomorrow, right? And so the presence of generative AI is also a potential threat to our ability to, well, trust our own eyes, the most central way of forming beliefs, which is so-called direct perception. There's lots of studies out there that are saying that by 2026, something like 80 to 90% of all content on the internet will be synthetic, as in it will be either generated completely by AI or it'll be partly generated by AI. And so that you can imagine that this should raise some worries. It raises worries in particular about our epistemic agency and political agency. So let me say a little bit more about epistemic agency and political agency. Epistemic agency is just a philosopher's way of saying that to be responsible for our beliefs and to be responsible for our actions based on those beliefs, we need to have some level of control over how we form those beliefs and how we revise those beliefs. Same as with political agency. Right? Political agency, the ability to form political beliefs or politically relevant beliefs, and the ability to act on them and revise them, obviously depends on epistemic agency, right? And so both of these things could potentially be threatened or are being threatened, I think, to some extent, in the presence of micro-targeting, nudging, generative AI. Now, nobody, I think, under the sun believes that we have to always completely freely come to our beliefs. We are creatures of culture, right? We are raised in a culture, we're raised in a family. None of our beliefs are truly somehow just our own. Of course, we're exposed to viewpoints that influence us. So to be free in the way we form beliefs is not to be completely not manipulated, right? But I take it that it's intuitive to most of us that there's got to be some upper limit of manipulation and influence past which we can't say that we're epistemically responsible and that we can act politically responsibly. And so then the question is, to what extent are things like nudging and micro-targeting and generative AI's empowerment of nudging and micro-targeting, to what extent are these things truly a threat to our epistemic agency and political agency, and what can we do about that? So as I've already mentioned, I just want to sort of flag some of the key effects that those 5 phenomena I mentioned, so digital echo chambers, filter bubbles, nudging, micro-targeting, and generative AI, some of the effects they have on these 2 key agencies we need to participate in a liberal democracy, namely epistemic agency and political agency. So we've all, as I've said, already seen the effect of echo chambers and digital echo chambers in particular on the post-truth phenomenon, right? So people live in their social media worlds. Within those social media worlds, they only get exposed, sometimes deliberately, sometimes algorithmically driven, only get exposed to people who have similar views as themselves. And so that sort of radicalizes them and further polarizes us. And I think our next speaker is going to some extent address this further. Nudging and micro-targeting are only going to get better. As I said, just this morning, there was an excellent example from the Indian election of large-scale micro-targeting that is really sophisticated. And the reason nudging is going to get better is because nudging and micro-targeting doesn't require a robust fancy schmancy theory of human psychology. All it needs is to get us to do what they want us to do, right? So whatever model is most persuasive, whichever model that drives the way information is presented to us or the way we engage with that information, whichever model gets us to engage the most or respond to it in the right sort of way, whatever that is, whatever the designer or the developer wants, is going to be the one that's used. And so we have really good reasons to think that both nudging and micro-targeting are going to get better. Our models are going to get better, but so is our data. We're going to have more data, more access to data, and so and that together with generative AI, the ability to produce things that nudge you, things that micro-target you, are going to be particularly dangerous and threaten our ability to freely and truly engage as political agents in a liberal democracy. Finally, I want to say that, and I mentioned this already, but generative AI, I think, is unlike nudging, unlike digital echo chambers, unlike epistemic bubbles, which have been around. And so this is just sort of like a stronger, more powerful version of manipulation. Generative AI is truly new, and it undermines the most common way we form beliefs, which is direct perception. I see things, I hear things. Most of our beliefs that at least we resort to at first to sort of make sure that we should believe is our direct perception. And so generative AI is undermining our ability to trust our own ways of forming any belief, and with that, political belief. And as we get exposed, I take it to more deep fakes, I think we're going to start sort of trusting our own direct perception even more, or even less. Okay, so then what do we do about that, which I think is a much more exciting question to be asking. I think there are 6 key, well, there's probably more, but I'm going to focus on 6 key tools we could be using to address some of these threats to our liberal democracy that specifically focus on political agency. So regulation is an obvious one. I'll say a little bit about that. Audits and risk assessments, I think, are probably the best tools, well, one of the 2 best tools we have in our toolbox in addressing the AI threat to liberal democracy. Recognizing epistemic rights, potentially. This is Matthias Rees's idea. Self-regulation. Using AI for good, using AI for nudging. And finally, the other, I think, best tool is trying to promote intellectual virtues. So let me say a little bit about each one of these. So, around the world, both in the US and in Europe, people are trying to come up with regulation to limit deepfakes in political process, to limit VLOPs, very large online platforms, ability to create echo chambers, to assure that very large online platforms like anything from Facebook or Instagram to Wikipedia engages in responsible content moderation. That's, for example, what the Digital Services Act that has just come into power does. So both in Europe and in the US, there has been a strong attempt, and both locally and federally, there's been a strong attempt to improve on regulation. Interestingly enough, the EU path to this and the US path to this have been very different. EU has taken the way of coming up with this massive new legislation, whereas US has taken the form both of local laws and state laws, and then a lot of enforcement. So both FTC and EEOC had seen themselves as sort of playing a significant role in regulating AI-driven threats. A part of what all of these regulatory tools require are third-party audits. This includes bias audits. This includes disparate impact audits, as well as risk assessments and risk management. And in my mind, and I'm partial to this because I do a lot of audits and I do a lot of risk assessment for purposes of compliance, but I do think that at a minimum, third-party audits, just like we have for financial services or for financial industry, third-party audits and required risk management are sort of essential tools for assuring that very large online platforms, social media, and other sort of AI-driven threats to liberal democracy sort of have some type of control over them, some type of regulation. Thirdly, epistemic rights. There's a number of scholars, as I mentioned, Matthias Rees is probably the most prominent among them, who have recommended that potentially there's some reasons to just come up with a new set of rights, maybe human rights potentially, namely epistemic rights. Rights that you have to control over how information about you is used, but also right to control and assure protection over how you get information. I think this is a good idea. I don't think we should worry about the proliferation of human rights too much here, as in we keep on coming up with new human rights. But this is a new threat to our ability to form beliefs, and so it might be good to think about new ways of protecting it through having explicit rights. Fourthly, self-regulation. This has been what the big tech has been trying to suggest. So we're going to regulate ourselves. Look at us. We have excellent risk assessment. Look at us. We have risk management teams. We have excellent content moderation. Just leave it up to us, says the big tech, and we'll be fine. To some extent, this might work. So some of the laws, including the Digital Services Act, not only holds you to elements of the law itself, but also holds you to whatever practice you assert you're implementing. So they'll hold you to whatever best practices you say you are following. So I think self-regulation has a role to play, but it's probably not sort of the silver bullet. There's also good reasons to think that we could use AI to engage in sort of good nudging. So numerous people have suggested, Professor Sunstein among them, that maybe we can use technology to make sure that people get exposed to alternative ideas, right? So just like algorithms maximize your engagement with a particular content, they maximize, how much time you spend on a particular content. Maybe we can assure that algorithms also expose you to alternative points of view. So that could be one way we could use AI to potentially nudge you in the right sort of direction, nudge us all in the right sort of direction. Finally, and I think this is the key element of any potential solution, is assuring that we develop intellectual virtues both at the elementary school level and high school level and college level, higher education level. I think as the technology creates more space, AI is going to allow us to have personalized learning systems and independent tutoring, adaptive learning system. As our education actually creates space through technology, I think that space should be filled with explicit and formalized development of intellectual virtues because, well, we're going to need it, and a part of our educational system's role should be raising good citizens. So I'm going to leave you with just a few sort of final worries, I guess. In spite of these 6 solutions that I think jointly can make a dent or at least start to regulate some of these significant threats to liberal democracy, I think there are 2 sort of lingering worries I have. One is that AI is going to keep on getting better. Whatever we throw at it, it's going to try to overcome. Why? Well, because it's always been the same. People are going to try to influence our political process, sometimes semi-legitimately, sometimes legitimately, sometimes illegitimately. And they have a new tool in their toolbox, and that tool is AI. And as AI gets better, and as you and I get better at, let's say, recognizing deep fakes or not being influenced by them, they're going to get better at coming up with technology that manipulates both how we form beliefs and how we decide to act on them. So that's one worry, that technology is going to outpace our ability to develop the sort of character that can beat it. And then a related worry is that we have so far been doing this whack-a-mole solutions, right? So there's a new problem. Oh my goodness, big tech or something like Facebook contributes to depression and suicide in girls. Let's have a congressional hearing. Let's do something about it. But that's usually 5-10 years after the problem has emerged. Same is with deep fakes. Same is with all these other threats to our political process. And so I think there's a really important step we need to take as a society, which is this ethical foresight approach, which is I think we need to today think about what's going to happen in 10 or 15 years or 50 if there is, let's say, quantum computing. What happens if we end up with significantly better data sets and significantly more sophisticated, let's say, generative AI models? How do we respond to those in time to make sure that we protect our political process and assure that a liberal democracy can survive this sort of threat? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
It's a complete honor and thrilled to be here. I want to thank you all for your service. My dad was in the Navy, and it's an inspiration, and it's awesome to be on the premises. So I'm trying to look at every face here for personal gratitude. So my focus is going to be on polarization, not on polar bears, but the generative AI, or maybe I in concert with the generative AI, produce the polar bear. Here's a study, a real study by a social scientist with the unlikely name Stoner. What Stoner tried to do was to see how people in groups would approach risky situations. So here's the setup, and I want you to imagine you're part of the group or you're an observer, and the question is, what's going to happen? You have a bunch of people, let's just stipulate regular people, who are asked, are you going to invest in a risky company? Or are you going to get on an airplane in circumstances in which you're not feeling very well, and things might be really terrible if you get sick on the plane? Or are you going to enter into a competition which you might lose? Or are you going to do something military where the chance of success is 1/X? Then you elicit the group members' judgments. Then you have members of the group enter into a deliberating process. And the question is, what is the group going to do compared to what the individuals who composed it were going to do? So let's suppose the average member of the group is kind of inclined, maybe, to engage in the risky military enterprise. What will the group, after deliberation, think? What would you expect? The fact is, the slide gives away the answer, there was a systematic tendency towards risk-taking. Groups are more risky than their members, eliciting what was long thought of as the risky shift, meaning that if the individual was kind of cautious, the group would end up quite risk-inclined, and the risky shift would combine actually more extremism in favor of risky behavior, more confidence that risk-taking behavior is a good idea, and more unity in favor of risk-taking. Okay, now let's shift, shall we, from risk-taking behavior to politics. Suppose the issue is, should the United States enter an agreement to deal with climate change? Is that a good idea? I was involved in a study, which very much like the risky shift study, in which a bunch of people from Boulder, Colorado, were asked to give their private anonymous views. Is this a good idea? And then to deliberate in groups with people from Boulder, in which people from Colorado Springs were asked to do exactly the same thing. And you may know that Colorado Springs is right of center and Boulder, Colorado is left of center. And the question is, what is going to happen to the group members after they talk to each other? And as in the risky shift experiment, modeled completely on them, we had anonymous statements of views in Boulder, anonymous statements of views in Colorado Springs, and then the Boulder people talked to the Boulder people in groups and reached a collective judgment, and the Colorado Springs people talked to the Colorado Springs people and reached a collective judgment. What do you think would happen? Okay, here is the kind of staggering fact. Before people talked to each other, the Boulder people were a little to my left. That's to my left. The Colorado Springs people were a little to my right, but they overlapped. There were people in Colorado Springs who thought, you know, climate change is kind of a problem. We probably should have an international agreement. And there were people in Boulder who thought the economy is the #1 priority and international agreement scares me. After they talked to each other, the people in Colorado Springs occupied a different universe from the people in Boulder. People in Boulder went whoosh to the left. They thought after they talked to each other as group members and in their post-deliberation anonymous views, they thought a treaty yesterday. We need that treaty. And the people in Colorado Springs thought, after talking to each other, a treaty? Have you lost your mind? We've got other problems. That is to suggest that the Colorado Springs people, after talking to one another, were like the risky shift people, going toward unanimity, confidence, and extremism, and the people in Boulder were exactly the same. Okay, what about juries? Groups are like juries. People who use Facebook are like juries. Suppose people are asked individually, how bad do you think it is that a company has come up with a baldness cure that really doesn't work on a scale of 0 to 8, where 0 is not bad at all and 8 is really, really horrible? I think on a scale of 0 to 8, a failed baldness cure is a 12. But most Americans think on a scale of 0 to 8, a failed baldness cure is a 3. So that's the view before they start deliberating. Now take an exercise machine designed specifically for the elderly, which turns out to break. So if you're 86 years old and trying to exercise, you're going to get really badly hurt because the machine breaks down. The average member of a group of Americans on the scale of 0 to 8 is around 6. That's pretty bad, both in terms of outrageousness and in terms of appropriate punishment. And we can translate it into a $1 fine if we want. We did that. Now ask yourself, once the baldness cure people are talking to each other, what are they going to come up with as a group? And once the exercise machine people are talking to each other, what are they going to come up with a group? The baldness machine people, baldness machine, would that there were such a thing. The baldness medicine people ended up, if they were before deliberation, the median was at 3, they ended up at 2. They shifted toward more leniency. The people who were upset about the exercise machine for the elderly, which is to say most people, if they were at 6 before they deliberated, they ended up at 7 or 8. And this was systematic. More extremism in favor of leniency, a deliberating group, more extremism in forms of severity in a deliberating group where people started out mad. People who are mad talking to one another get really, really mad. People who are thinking, are you kidding? A baldness cure? They start thinking, have you lost your mind? A baldness cure? That's not a problem. Okay, these are all experiments. Here's something that is actually not an experiment. It's our country. Suppose you get 3 appointees of a Democratic president together on a 3-judge panel, DDD. How's the Democratic appointee likely to vote compared to how a Democratic appointee votes on a panel that has 2 Ds and 1 R? Got the setup? You have 2 Obama appointees, let's say, and 1 Trump appointee, or 3 Obama appointees. How do the Democratic appointees vote depending on whether there are 3 of them or there's 1 Republican appointee there. And this is real. These are 3-judge panels in cases that involve, let's say, environmental protection, the rights of labor unions, discrimination on the basis of race and sex. That's the setup. And we're talking not about an experiment. This is thousands of votes. I got my students counting thousands of votes. Hardly any of them has had to undergo therapy after that extremely mind-numbing exercise. And we did exactly the same for Republican appointees, asking if you get 3 Bush appointees together, how do they vote compared to how they vote when it's 2 Republican appointees and a Democratic appointee? Okay, here's the astounding finding. I confess I didn't expect to get this. The likelihood that a Democratic appointee votes in the stereotypical left-of-center direction shoots up dramatically when it's 3 of them together. If there's 1 Republican appointee there, they moderate. The likelihood that a Republican appointee votes in a stereotypically right-of-center direction, in, say, an environmental case or a civil rights case, they are much more likely to moderate if there's 1 Democratic appointee on the panel. And the data difference is very dramatic. Now, if I haven't been completely obscure, the judges' data is the same as the Colorado data, as the risky shift data, as the jury data, where 3 Republican appointees sitting together end up much more extreme than if there's 1 Democratic appointee there, and the same is exactly symmetrically true for the Democratic appointee. Now, if you're not amazed by this finding, here's the thing that I have to remind myself in order to show why it's startling. If you have 3 Democratic appointees together, they don't have more power than if it's 2 Democratic appointees and 1 Republican appointee. Guess how many votes you need to get a majority? 2. The 2 Democratic appointees can say to the Republican appointee, sorry, you're outvoted, go ahead and dissent. And the Republican appointees can say the same thing. 2 Ds have the votes, and yet they moderate significantly. The 2 Ds in the presence of the single R, and the 2 Rs in the presence of a single D. Okay, why is this happening? I've seen the tapes of the Colorado experiments, and you can see all 3 of the explanations I'm about to give you in real time. Suppose you have a bunch of people from Boulder, left of center, talking about climate change. Some of them are going to be nervous about a treaty, but it's Boulder, left of center. Most want the treaty. As they talk to each other, people are saying climate change is a really serious problem. It's getting very hot in Texas. People are extremely vulnerable all over the world. The scientific evidence supporting the view that climate change is real is overwhelming. And the minority people who think, well, we got other priorities, are listening to the people who are more numerous, who are saying, we got to do this. The informational content in a room of people who are left of center or in favor of risk-taking will dwarf the informational content of the people in that room that is on the other side. And if people are listening to each other, they'll shift. Take any issue of science or politics or anything, and imagine you have a group of 8 people, and 6 of them think X, and 2 of them think Y. After they're listening to each other, X is going to look really good, and Y is going to look kind of thinly supported. And that's exactly what happened in Colorado Springs and in Boulder, though asymmetrically. Okay, here's the most fun thing to observe, which has been established in experimental settings which are rigorously trying to test what is accounting for what I'm describing. You get people who are thinking about some scientific or military or political issue or an issue about whether to break up with someone you're not sure you're in love with. If people are unsure in a group, they will moderate. They'll be humble. So if you ask any one of us some question about which we don't have terrific information, we'll say we're not sure, maybe we lean this way. But then, if someone corroborates your view, you are fortified and more confident. And the confidence leads to extremism. And that's observed in real time in all of the settings I've described. Corroboration produces confidence, produces extremism. Here's the third and the most insidious. In my Colorado groups, there are people who are thinking, I don't think what the majority thinks is right. But you can see them getting smaller and smaller and smaller, not because they're cowardly, but because they're human, as they see that everyone else in the room is inclined to think they're full of nonsense. Can I tell you parenthetically, the most boring book written on our military success in World War II has the best appendix I've ever read. It's a really boring technical book, and then the appendix says why the United States won World War II. And it was said that the United States couldn't win militarily because we didn't have the discipline and the organization and the sense of authority that Hitler had. We had plenty, but not like Hitler, not like the fascists. And the author said it's just the opposite. We won because in our military there's freedom. And if things are going wrong, someone in the ranks, maybe my dad was one of them, would say to his superior, sir, we got to do it another different way, or have you considered? The idea that was our comparative advantage. We had authority and freedom. Okay, in groups, people have freedom, but they might self-silence if they feel themselves disliked in a group of people who seem confident and human. Okay, now let's shift, shall we? Right now on Facebook, the Colorado experiment, the jury study, the judge study, and the risky shift is happening on newsfeed, where people are being exposed to louder versions of what they thought before they started to think, and more confident versions of ideas that they have with some quiet in their head. On Twitter or X, this is also happening in this very moment, where the Colorado experiment is being replicated, with people shifting whoosh to whatever place you think, just by virtue of the fact that they're listening mostly to louder versions of what they think. It's the Colorado experiment online. What we know is that many people, maybe most of the people in this room, either don't live their lives on social media or live their lives with a degree of skepticism and diversity on social media, but that large numbers of Americans are like the sorting that I described in Colorado and on the 3-judge panels. Liberalism, not left of center, liberalism of the sort that helps define the culture for which my dad fought in World War II and for which you are engaged in service. Liberalism depends on a respect for the force of the argument. Ours is a deliberative democracy in which people are attentive not to the identity of the speaker, but to the reasons given by the speaker. I would give 3 kind of specifications of deliberative democracy in action. They're really mundane. Will you bear with me? They're also very short. One is the phase down of lead from gasoline under the Bush administration. That's something that happened because people were attending not to what do people like me think, but what does lead do to lungs? And can we get rid of it at a cost that's reasonable? think, if you would, of the fact that every car in the United States now is being sold with a rear view camera so you can see in back. Yes? Did that come about because Boulder or Colorado Springs liked it? No, it came about because immersion in the details showed that their little children, and also Labrador Retrievers and German Shepherds, I care about those, I have some of those, that were vulnerable and sometimes killed because people couldn't see in back, and that installation of the cameras reduced the risks to lots, while also making driving a lot harder. Doesn't matter whether you're from Boulder or Colorado Springs, you probably like that. If you traveled to get here or are traveling in the next couple of months, I hope you have either TSA pre or global entry, initiatives designed to maintain security while making flying better and easier for people. And those are things that had nothing to do with R's or D's. Okay, here's my personal favorite liberal, the champion, the GOAT, the greatest of all time, the Tom Brady of political theory, said, "It is hardly possible to overstate the value in the present state of human improvement of placing human beings in contact with other persons dissimilar to themselves and with modes of thought and action unlike those with which they're familiar." Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have the microphones for questions. If you would, just kindly identify yourself before you begin speaking. Ma'am.
Yeah, so I'm Colleen Watson. I'm a professor of philosophy at West Point. All of this work is like right up my research interest, so I have the burden of having 1,000 questions in my head and trying to choose one. One thing I did want to ask, since I have cast on scene up here, and nudging was mentioned, I was wondering if, Jovana, the kind of nudging you were talking about qualifies as the kind of nudging that Sunstein and Thaler, famously wrote about. It seems to me that the kinds of nudging that appear in Nudge aren't quite the nudging that you were talking about. So maybe both of you guys, if you could clarify the differences, if there are differences. And then also there seemed to be some hope that there were good forms of nudging from AI or regulating AI type of nudging, and I would just like to hear more about those maybe more hopeful forms.
Okay, so I much appreciated the remarks, but the word nudging was being used in a way that was unfamiliar to me. And I'm smiling because I wrote a book kind of twice on the topic, maybe 4 times.
I was watching you closely when, it was, when
okay,
nudging was brought up.
So a nudge in social science and philosophy is defined as an intervention that preserves freedom of choice while also steering people in a direction that makes their lives go better by their own lights. So take a GPS device as an iconic nudge, or a warning that this has peanuts in it, so if you're allergic, don't do that, or don't eat that, or a calorie label, or some information about the nutritional contents of food, or the stickers you get when you buy a car that tell you about fuel economy, or information about the relevant social norm given to doctors so they don't prescribe so many antibiotics, or automatic enrollment in a savings plan, a 401k plan with easy and transparent opt-out. So those are nudges, and the Obama, Trump, and Biden administration all embraced Executive Order 13707, I think it is, which is basically the pro-nudging executive order. So there's another word that captures, I think, what was used, and semantics aren't so interesting. But the other thing, I'm not sure what the word is, but I'm sure nudging, as she described it, I don't like very much. And I do like I don't despise my own book, so.
Yeah, so the nudging that I had in mind is the way developers of algorithms usually use them for like Netflix, for example. So you will get presented, let's say, with the same movie, but you will get a different thumbnail than I get. And the idea there is that given your past choices in, let's say, Netflix movies, they think that this will appeal to you, and that showing you this thumbnail versus showing me a different thumbnail will persuade you to watch the same movie as I will watch. So that's the sort of nudging that I had in mind, and that's usually how, at least the developers I've worked with, use the concept of nudging relative to AI-enabled, algorithmic nudging, not nudging.
Hello, I'm Midshipman Fourth Class Lee, and I wanted to ask, how can we kind of diminish polarization and radicalization on social media while also maintaining the First Amendment and not doing censorship?
Okay, well, a great way to avoid a First Amendment violation is for the government not to do anything. So that makes it easy. So for designers to think creatively without any government engagement at all about how to reduce the flow of polarization engineering, that's a really worthy project, let's call it. And you want to know what the project looks like? There's an experiment done by my collaborator, Tali Sharat, who's a neuroscientist, where people push a trust button rather than the like button. And you got it? Trust. And there are all sorts of good things that happen in her kind of mock social media platform from the trust button. The circulation of falsehoods diminish, the likelihood that people will say things that are untrue diminishes, and it looks like certain forms of insidious polarization stop because people are saying trust, and people know people are going to say trust. Now, maybe that's not going to work at scale, but that's an avenue into something maybe everyone in this room can think about that might work at scale.
I think one of the most important things to do, which is why I said I think audits are incredibly important, and the Digital Services Act, albeit not applicable, it's an EU law, but it's applicable to all the very large online platforms that operate in EU. So that includes, Facebooks and Metas of this world. The Digital Services Act requires audits of content moderation. So whatever our appetite for censorship or not censorship, whatever our understanding of the First Amendment or freedom of speech and its importance, we can't implement it until we know how exactly these very large online platforms actually engage in content moderation. And so at a minimum, doing audits and assuring that they have clear policies, understanding whether it's bots or it's human or it's a combination of the two, like let's say in Wikipedia. It's really important to understand that before we can do any sort of regulation or legislation around content moderation.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Midshipman Fourth Class Masha. First, I just want to say my favorite quote's a John Stuart Mill quote, so I'd like to shout out. Second, so my question is somewhat similar. I'm curious about when an idea is formed or started or interjected into a society or a community, either by a foreign adversary or through synthetic means, but it eventually becomes a somewhat organic thought because it catches on in our current environment. From the perspective of social media companies or organizations that have a lot of influence in regulating people's sources of information, how do you think they should manage the balance between something that starts off as malicious or interjected into a community for malicious purposes before it becomes an organic contribution to a liberal society?
That's great. So maybe we can get empirical about what you said. What you said is completely right. And here's the mechanism. It's called the illusory truth effect. If someone says something 2 or 3 times, then people tend to believe it's true. And the illusory truth effect is itself a beneficiary of the illusory truth effect because it's said more than 2 or 3 times, but it's still true. And that is insidious because it suggests that if something's easy to process, the brain deems it likely to be credible. So easier, truthier. That, I think, has some lessons for, let's just say for the moment, fully voluntary action. That if someone is spreading something that's false and unambiguously damaging, like the polls are closing at 2 in the afternoon today, or the election's been postponed for a day. Take those as conceivable examples. Not to be content that debate and discussion will work, but instead to reduce distribution or take it down is a very thinkable thought. And of course, if this is done voluntarily, we don't have a technical First Amendment issue.
Thank you.
A comment and then a question that one or both of you may decline to wade into. The comment, Cass, is I couldn't help noticing rather, that your presentation, at least on the problem side, had nothing to do with technology at all. These were people interacting face-to-face in ways that the Greeks would have recognized. So the problems that you're talking about are problems of psychology, right, and not problems of technology. And that raises the question of whether technology can be part of the solution of those problems, even though it's not the cause of the problems themselves. Now my question. I couldn't help noticing that Jonathan Haidt's book on the impact of social media on teenagers and young adults debuted at #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. That tells me that we are in the early stages of a social panic about the impact of social media. So I wonder, could the two of you assess the state of the evidence on the impact of social media as you understand it? Or if you want to beg off and say it's not something I've looked at sufficiently, that's also a perfectly adequate answer.
I mean, I'll just I'll say something about the first point Bill said, which is that I think that the nudging, as I'm using the term, and the echo chambers and the filter bubbles and the micro-targeting to some extent have always been around. And this is just a question of technology just making it maybe quantitatively different, but not qualitatively. I think generative AI is potentially a new type of threat that's different in kind. So I wonder if that might be a new type of a threat. And just a quick thought about the actual question, which is, I've been working on this, since 10 years ago and before that. And so my kids to this day were the only kids who don't have smartphones or social media, and they're high schoolers. So that's my view on it. I think that sort of captures, my worries about social media and how we should all be worried about the effects on, especially young brains. I don't know how it affects adults, but I think there's genuine and lots of evidence that it has pretty significant addictive trends, like things like TikToks and things like that. So yeah.
Okay, so my assessment of the empirical evidence on the polarization front is consistent with the idea. Tom Hanks, remember he was an astronaut before he was an actor, and he famously said on Apollo 13, "Houston, we have a problem." Or was he acting even in that? Maybe he was acting in that. Okay, with respect to the adverse effects on democracy, Houston, we have a problem. So the heightening of the problem of polarization, the Colorado problem, let's call it, that's real. That's my understanding of the data. Though there's a rearguard action by very intelligent people that is doubting that. On hate, the hate debate, H-A-I-D-T, not H-A-T-E, the hate debate about the effects on youngsters with respect to depression and anxiety and so forth, that's very heated now. And I think the right reaction today is what Cho and Lai said about the French Revolution. It's too soon to tell. We don't know yet.
Good afternoon. I'm Sonia Tagang from the U.S. Air Force Academy. I think it's fair to say that authoritarian leaders can use AI and deepfakes to spread propaganda and maintain legitimacy in their regimes. Do you think that international organizations such as the United Nations should get involved in the regulation of deepfakes and AI on social media, or do you think it should be left up to states to regulate that?
I mean, I wonder, so you asked a should question, and that's a difficult question. In terms of they are, so the DSA and many other EU regulations they just, because they apply to very large online platforms, it doesn't really matter that it's only applicable, it's only applicable if you have X number of EU, users. Well, that's almost anyone. So they still have to do all the same governance structures, all the same risk management structures, all the same content moderation audits, regardless of where they are. So that's one way that sort of you can have international regulation, international effects of sort of regional, in this case, regulation. But I think your actual question is really difficult, whether the UN should step in or some regional organization, and I don't know what to say about that.
I don't think the UN has legal authority with respect to that kind of thing. It might have expressive authority. So we have a division of labor in our family. My wife was UN ambassador and is now running USAID. So anything that involves other countries, I say, she can figure that out.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Master Chief Rico Modafari from Naval Special Warfare Basic Training Command. When you talked about solutions, your third solution, recognizing epistemic rights, are there any nations that are leading the way with respect to these kinds of issues and how to set boundaries? It's my understanding that there's parts of Europe where if you go and map the Wi-Fi, you can get arrested. I think that may be related, so.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where the UN might actually be able to step in. I think exactly in the expressive value. So recognizing, let's say, expressive rights, just like, we always had the right to, let's say, information, a right to freedom of expression. And then on the scene came the internet, and over 10 or 15 years, not having it or not having access to free internet became a genuine threat to our ability to exercise our other rights. And so conversations started being had about whether or not it makes sense to talk about a human right to the internet, right? And these are still conversations that are worthwhile having. So I think, both Matthias Rees and others who have proposed epistemic rights, I think what they have in mind is something that's parallel to that. So as these threats become bigger and affect our other rights that we, political ability to engage in political participation and things like that, that it's worthwhile protecting us from these potential threats by asserting the right to, the epistemic rights. And I think that something like the UN doing it would have this huge expressive sort of aim, as in asserting that this is an important thing, that the threat is an important thing, that individual states ought to start building structures to promote or support our right to, information.
Maybe I'll give a little notation on that. So Mill is the GOAT, but Burke is kind of Peyton Manning. Edmund Burke. He's really good, and he's not on the same team as Mill. Is this too obscure? Mill is a canonical liberal. Burke is a canonical conservative who like traditions. So let's talk about Burke, shall we? There's a tradition in Anglo-American societies, you can find versions of it in others, where reputation is a central part of your thing. That means for any of us, if we're portrayed as, let's say, drug dealers or thieves or something, we've been libeled or defamed, and there's something we can do by way of getting redress. And that is both an ex post corrective, we get compensation, and even better, it's an ex ante deterrent. If people say that you are a drug dealer, they're at risk. People involved in democratic life have historically, on Burkean grounds, been protected by that too. And there's an idea in our culture which is that that's even more kind of sacrosanct than for individuals who aren't in political life. Because the reason you protect the political participant reputation is not only for that person, but it's for the rest of us. If someone's trying to become one of our leaders, then they're being portrayed as a drug dealer or a criminal. It's just not so. Then we excise them from the public domain, and that's our loss because it's not true. Okay, connecting your question with the First Amendment point, New York Times against Sullivan, a Supreme Court case, basically was a truck that ran through libel law. And it's not clear that that's a perfect truck. I'm having a very bad metaphor here. The idea that libel law in its traditional form is self-evidently an offense to the First Amendment. It's complicated. And Justice Thomas, to his credit, is all over this point. He's questioning this. And if this seems a little like old-fashioned and esoteric, think of a deep fake that portrays anyone in this room in a horrific way, or that portrays one of our would-be leaders in a horrific way. That's either the thing itself, it's libelous, or it's a really close cousin. And to revive, let's say, the best version of our tradition with respect to libel law as a way of protecting, like, your neighbor, and as a way of protecting maybe someone who could be a great leader in the Navy or could be a great leader in Washington. It's that this is a worthy enterprise. So Justice Thomas has laid down a gauntlet, and whether or not he's ultimately right, respectful attention should be paid.
All right. The lack of further questions I will attribute to the eloquence and the exhaustiveness, not the exhaustingness of our speakers. So I hope you'll join me in thanking them.
All right. And thank you, Graham, too. We have two things to do now. The first is take a picture. So exit the auditorium, take a right, and there's a black sphere that's balanced on water, and we'll take a picture right next to that. Immediately after that, which will only take about 5 minutes, we'll go up the stairs, upstairs, and there's a nice balcony terrace that overlooks the river, and we'll have a couple of hours of cocktails. So thank you for attending. Great questions, and we'll see you tomorrow.